Welcome to the debate. When we think of the great architectural masterpieces of antiquity, especially religious sites, we usually envision these environments of profound reverence.
Oh, absolutely. Like total monastic silence.
Right, exactly. We picture silence, we imagine, the faint echo of a chant or the quiet murmur of prayer. But if you were to actually step into the first century Herodian temple in Jerusalem during Passover, well, that peaceful image would instantly shatter.
Yeah, it would be sensory overload.
Completely. You wouldn't hear silent meditation. You'd be hit by the deafening bleating of thousands of sheep, the sharp clinking of foreign coins, and just this aggressive, chaotic shouting of merchants. Which brings us to today's topic. For those of you studying theology with us, we're looking at one of the most provocative accounts in the New Testament, which is the temple cleansing in John 2.
And it really is a dramatic scene. I mean, Jesus actually fashions a whip.
Right. So when Jesus fashioned that whip of cords and drove the merchants from the complex, our central question is this: was he primarily attacking systemic, corrupt economic greed? Or, and this is where we divide, was he confronting a noisy business activity that created a ritual distraction, essentially preventing the marginalized from worshiping?
It's a massive distinction to make, especially when we look at the historical and biblical texts.
It is. And as New Testament history scholars, we have different takes. I hold the perspective that Jesus' actions were primarily targeting the noisy distraction that destroyed the ritual purity of the space and completely blocked Gentile worship.
Right. And as a fellow New Testament scholar, I represent the opposing view here. I argue that Jesus was militantly attacking systemic economic greed, specifically dismantling how the temple apparatus exploited the poor and marginalized under the really intense pressure of Roman occupation.
Okay, so let me just lay out the foundation for why the spatial desecration is the core issue here. Jesus was motivated by a profound theological zeal for the purity of the worship space itself. And to understand this, we have to look at the exact geography of where this market was taking place.
You're talking about the court of the Gentiles.
Exactly. The Herodian temple grounds were highly segregated. The merchants and the money changers were set up in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, and this court was separated from the inner courts by a stone lattice barricade known as the soreg.
Yeah, the mourning wall.
Right, and this wasn't just like a polite decorative fence. It literally had warning signs carved into the limestone blocks in both Greek and Latin, threatening death to any foreigner who crossed it.
Which is a terrifying context for worship.
Right. So this outer court, it was the absolute only place on earth where non-Jews could legally come to pray to the God of Israel. And here's the thing. There's actually very little historical evidence that these merchants were corrupt companions in graft or that they were, inherently price gouging.
Well, I wouldn't say there's little evidence of corruption, but
Let me just finish this thought. The primary issue is that the mere presence of bleating sheep, oxen, and commerce turned the one place meant for Gentile prayer into a chaotic barnyard. Jesus was destroying a distraction. The business activity inherently destroyed the temple's intended theological design as a house of prayer for all nations.
I hear that, but I come at it from a completely different way. While the spatial geography is important, I don't deny that, you absolutely cannot detach that temple market from the socioeconomics of the Roman occupation.
How so?
Well, the system was inherently designed for extraction. By Jewish law, stemming from Exodus 30, every registered male over 19 owed a half-shekel temple tax.
Right, the annual tax.
Exactly. But because of the Roman occupation, worshippers traveling to Jerusalem were carrying all sorts of foreign currencies, and the temple authorities absolutely refused to accept standard Roman coinage. They mandated that the tax be paid exclusively in Tyrian shekels.
Because of the silver content?
Yes, but here is the profound irony, and really the mechanism of the greed. The Tyrian shekel bore the stamped image of Melkart, the Tyrian Hercules. It was literally a pagan idol.
Wow. Yeah, that is a glaring contradiction.
Right? Yet the Sadducees, these aristocratic priests who controlled the Temple Mount, demanded this specific coin. Why? Because the Tyrian shekel had a 94% silver purity. They were willing to completely overlook the second commandment against graven images just to maximize their silver intake.
So they compromised theology for profit.
Exactly. And to facilitate this, the money changers held a monopoly on the exchange rate. charging a premium fee. Furthermore, consider the animal merchants. Leviticus allows the poor to substitute doves for a lamb if they can't afford one.
Yeah, the provision for the poor.
Right, and when Jesus enters, he specifically targets the money changers' coins, pouring them out, and he overturns the tables of the dove sellers. I mean, he is physically dismantling the machinery that extracts wealth from the most vulnerable worshipers.
Okay, I see why you're drawn to the socioeconomic angle, especially with the hypocrisy of the Tyrian shekel. That's a strong point. But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the transaction itself was the primary sin, rather than the location of the transaction.
You think the location is that much more important?
I do. Let me give you an analogy, especially for our college audience listening. Imagine setting up a loud, chaotic stock exchange floor in the very center of a university library during finals week.
That sounds like a nightmare.
Exactly. But the primary issue there isn't whether the stock prices are fair or whether the brokers are charging an honest commission. The fundamental issue is that the activity completely destroys the intended purpose of the space.
Okay, I see the parallel you're drawing.
Right. And Jesus' specific command to the dove sellers in John 2 is, get these things out of here, stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace. Notice the exact wording there.
He doesn't mention the prices.
Right. He doesn't say, stop overcharging or lower your exchange rates. He attacks the very existence of the market within the sacred precinct. Look, if the religious leaders just wanted a convenient market, they could have set it up in the Kidron Valley, outside the temple walls.
Which they didn't do.
No, they didn't. By putting it in the court of the Gentiles, they were making a loud theological statement. The convenience of Jewish worshipers matters more than the spiritual access of the Gentiles. The Jewish worshipers had quiet, reverent inner courts to pray in. The Gentiles were left to pray in a stock exchange.
I hear the analogy and it's a good visual, but I would push back on the idea that the transaction and the location can be so neatly separated. You're ignoring the mechanics of how an emporion, which is the Greek word used here for a house of trade, how it actually functioned as an instrument of control.
An instrument of control? How so?
The location enabled the transaction. The Sanhedrin wasn't just a religious council. They were the de facto local government and the primary economic beneficiaries of the temple tax.
Well, sure, they benefited financially.
Right, and by locating the market inside the temple precincts, they controlled the monopoly. They controlled who could sell approved, unblemished animals, and they controlled the exchange rates. And who gets hurt most by monopolies?
The poorest people.
Exactly, the poorest people. When Jesus specifically overturns the tables of the dove sellers, he isn't just making a point about noise, he's making a point about power. He's acting against systemic economic injustice that has cloaked itself in religious obligation.
But if this is primarily about dismantling a corrupt economic monopoly, we have to grapple with the physical reality of what Jesus actually did and how he justified it. I mean, he didn't just stand up and deliver a critique of supply-side economics.
No, he was very physical.
He literally sat down, took the time to braid a whip out of cords, and physically drove them out. Many people today have this sanitized, overly gentle image of Jesus as a meek philosophical teacher. But here we see a militant purifier.
A terrifying one, honestly.
Yeah, and this wasn't a sudden, sinful fit of rage. The act of braiding a whip requires time and calculation. It was controlled, righteous indignation focused entirely on the holiness of the space.
But that calculation is exactly what points to a deeper systemic judgment. If we want to understand that calculated zeal, we have to look at the prophetic warnings of the Old Testament, specifically Malachi 3.
Okay, bring in Malachi.
Malachi prophesied that the Lord would suddenly come to his temple as a refiner's fire and like launderer's bleach. And who does Malachi say will be purified?
The priests.
Right. The prophecy explicitly states he will purify the sons of Levi, the priestly class. Jesus' actions here aren't just a critique of the merchants making noise. It is a direct prophetic indictment of the religious leaders' complicity in this market corruption. The Sanhedrin allowed it, profited from it, and Jesus is acting as the eschatological judge over a religious system that has failed its mandate.
Malachi is a really strong parallel, but notice the difference in execution and how the disciples interpreted it in the moment.
Malachi talks about purifying the sons of Levi. But John explicitly notes that Jesus' disciples immediately remembered Psalm 69, "Zeal for your house will consume me."
David's psalm.
Yes. David wrote those words, and the disciples see Jesus fulfilling them not just as a prophet doing a moral cleanup, but as a king claiming his property. He uses this display of divine authority to demand reverence. When he calls it my Father's house, he is asserting that he has the authority to purify the temple because the temple and ultimately all of creation belongs to him. He is declaring ownership.
I agree, he's claiming ownership. But that claim of authority raises a massive historical red flag. If Jesus is claiming absolute authority over the central economic engine of Judea, the timing of when he does this changes everything about how we interpret the event.
You're talking about the chronology issue between John and the Synoptics.
Exactly. This wasn't just a minor disruption. He literally shut down the central bank of Jerusalem during its busiest season. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this event happens at the very end of Jesus' ministry, right after the triumphal entry.
Right, during Holy Week.
Yes, and it is the direct catalyst that provokes the Sanhedrin to crucify him. It makes perfect historical sense. Disrupt the money, and the power structure will kill you within the week. But John places this event in chapter 2, at the very beginning of his ministry.
Well, that assumes we have to read ancient biographies strictly chronologically, which is really a modern bias. As a historian, I look at how ancient writers arranged material thematically to make profound theological points.
Wait, so you're arguing it only happened once, but John moved it?
Exactly. John places the temple cleansing right after the wedding at Cana, which was Jesus' first public miracle, where he turned water used for Jewish purification rites into wine. By immediately following that with the temple cleansing, John is establishing Jesus' supreme authority to replace the old systems with himself.
Setting the thematic stage, essentially.
Right. Furthermore, by putting it early, John frames Jesus' response to the leaders. When they demand a sign to prove his authority, he says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days." John is deliberately using this early event to point the readers straight toward the cross and the empty tomb right from the beginning of the narrative.
That is a common thematic reading, I'll grant you, but it overlooks the historical logistics of managing a city under Roman occupation. I hold the view that the temple cleansing was not a single historical event moved around for thematic purposes, but that it actually occurred twice.
2 separate cleansings?
Think about the crowd dynamics. If Jesus disrupted the temple early in his ministry, as John records, it serves as an initial, bold announcement of his messianic authority to the Sanhedrin. He is giving them a chance to repent. When they refuse and demand a sign instead, the stage is set.
And then he comes back?
Exactly. 3 years later, as recorded in the Synoptics, he returns to pronounce final judgment. The early cleansing is a warning, the late cleansing is the trigger for the crucifixion. Both serve distinct, historically credible functions without needing to rewrite John as purely thematic.
Well, whether we view it as one event, placed thematically, or 2 distinct historical actions, the dialogue that immediately follows in John is vital. When Jesus says, "Destroy this temple," the Jewish leaders respond incredulously, saying, "This temple took 46 years to build, and will you raise it up in 3 days?"
They were completely missing the point.
Completely. They are totally focused on the physical masonry. And to be fair, we have to acknowledge what a staggering architectural marvel this was. I mean, Herod the Great began expanding the temple around 20 BC. The retaining walls alone used stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons.
Josephus wrote about it, right?
Yeah, the Jewish historian Josephus described it as looking like a mountain of snow from a distance because of its gleaming white marble and massive gold plates. It was the absolute undeniable center of Jewish identity, economics, and worship. Yet they completely misunderstood him. They were looking at a physical building, while the true temple, the ultimate meeting place between God and humanity, was standing right in front of them in the flesh.
Exactly. Jesus wasn't just predicting his physical resurrection, he was fundamentally redefining the locus of worship. In the Old Testament, the temple was the unique, localized place where God's presence dwelled, going all the way back to the glory falling upon Solomon's temple in 2 Chronicles.
Right, the Shekinah glory.
Yes, but Jesus' incarnation, his death, and his resurrection rendered that physical, geographical building obsolete. When the veil of the temple was torn in two at his death, the barrier was destroyed. The theological shift is massive. Jesus' own body became the temple. And the Apostle Paul extends this logic remarkably in 1 Corinthians, declaring that the believer's body is now the temple of the Holy Spirit.
Right. And this is where the historical debate hits our modern reality. Because if God's Spirit no longer dwells in buildings made by human hands, but resides in the minds and bodies of believers, then how we manage our own internal temples becomes the critical issue of personal holiness.
That's a huge leap for a lot of students to make, but a necessary one.
It is. I want to bring in a perspective from historical church traditions here. The 19th century Bishop J.C. Ryle actually reflected on this passage and noted that bringing worldly matters into a space professed for worship is profoundly offensive to the nature of Christ. So if we apply that to the theological students studying this today, the question becomes, how are we commercializing our own faith spaces? What are the merchants occupying our minds?
It's an interesting question. But I would argue the primary threat to the modern internal temple isn't necessarily commercialization in the sense of selling physical wares or seeking financial gain. The modern equivalent of the court of the Gentiles isn't a literal bazaar, it is the attention economy.
Oh, that's a good point.
We're drowning in a completely different kind of noise. Think about the sensory overload of that first century courtyard, the bleating animals, the shouting, the clinking coins. Today, algorithms are explicitly designed to monetize our attention, keeping us in a state of constant digital distraction.
Just scrolling endlessly.
Exactly. If Jesus was outraged that the physical noise of commerce prevented the marginalized from connecting with God, what do we make of the constant digital noise we willingly invite into our own minds? It crowds out any capacity for silence, meditation, or reverence.
That reframes the issue brilliantly, honestly. Worship requires focus, and distraction is the enemy of focus. If our internal space is cluttered with the constant ping of notifications, anxieties about status or just the endless consumption of superficial entertainment, we have effectively set up tables for the money changers in our own minds.
And nobody forced us to do it. We invited them in.
Right. And overturning those tables requires the same kind of calculated zeal Jesus demonstrated. It means recognizing that our minds are prone to drift. The merchants didn't take over the Temple Mount in a single afternoon. It was a gradual accommodation.
A little bit at a time.
Exactly. First, one table was allowed in the outer court because it was convenient, then a pen for sheep, then another money changer. We drift from standards of holiness in much the same way. We compromise a little on our focus, a little on where we direct our attention, and suddenly our inner life resembles a chaotic marketplace.
The gradual accommodation is key, and driving it out isn't a passive exercise. Surrendering to that kind of purifying authority isn't always comfortable. It can feel like a whip of cords to our modern sensibilities, especially when we are so attached to our distractions.
Because it hurts to let go of them.
It does?
But the theological anchor here is that Jesus wasn't just performing a moral cleanup for the sake of strict rule following. He was acting as the great high priest. He was clearing the temple to point toward the day when he would offer his own life as the once and for all sacrifice. He dismantled the entire system of sheep, doves, and Tyrian shekels so that direct, immediate access to the divine would be available without a transaction fee, without a barricade, and without a middleman.
Well said. Let me pull our perspectives together as we close out this analysis. I maintained that the temple cleansing, historically and theologically, was primarily about removing noise and distraction. Jesus was restoring a place of prayer for all nations, vigorously defending the spiritual access of the Gentiles who had been spatially marginalized by the chaotic business of the Jewish sacrificial system, taking over their only place of worship.
And I maintain that while the spatial distraction was certainly a reality, Jesus' physical actions, specifically pouring out the high-purity Tyrian coins and targeting the dove sellers, demonstrate that he was primarily confronting the systemic greed. He was dismantling a monopoly that leveraged the requirements of the Mosaic Law to extract wealth from the most vulnerable under the shadow of Roman occupation.
Yet we both see that whether his primary target was systemic greed or ritual distraction, Jesus claims absolute authority over the temple because it belonged to him. His actions were a dramatic foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice of his own body, effectively ending the physical temple era and inaugurating the age where believers themselves become the dwelling place of God.
Exactly. We may weight the historical motives of the merchants differently, and we may certainly debate whether John's account is a thematic relocation or evidence of a second, earlier cleansing. But we align completely on the profound theological implications. The uncompromising zeal of Jesus challenges anyone studying this text to evaluate their own internal worship space.
Absolutely. We encourage everyone listening to deeply consider this narrative. Look at the historical mechanics of the Tyrian shekels, the physical barricade of the soreg, and just the sheer audacity of Jesus' actions. Ask yourself, what tables need to be overturned in your own life to protect your focus and reverence?
There is so much more to explore in the historical accounts of the Gospels, and we leave it to you to weigh the evidence.
But as you do, keep that analogy in your mind. If you wouldn't tolerate a chaotic stock exchange operating in the middle of a library during finals week, how much less should we tolerate the noise, the commerce, and the digital distractions of the world setting up shop in the sacred space of our own minds?
A vital framework to leave them with.
Thank you for joining us. Keep questioning, keep studying, and keep seeking the truth.